Well, I really like videos that make me think, and maybe you're the same as me in that area. This video by Emma Thorne, a popular YouTuber, really got me thinking. It's about supposed contradictions in the Bible. So I'm going to be taking my time to go through this video, make some remarks on it. If you see a change in my appearance, that's because I'm probably doing this over the course of several days. And I hope that this is something that's enjoyable and informative. And I hope that you'll leave your comments below and tell me what you think about all this.
John says that Jesus refused to be held or touched. And in Luke, the risen Jesus invites his followers to touch him to prove that he's not a ghost. Come on, bro. Touch me. See? Real as dude.
Well, that's a clip that Emma used in the introduction to her video. It's something that she covers later on, but I thought I'd comment on that because right off the bat there, right there in her intro, she's getting something wrong. In the Gospel of John, Jesus does tell one disciple, Mary, not to touch him, but a little later on, he invites one of his disciples, Thomas, to touch him. And that episode is then repeated from a different point of view in the Gospel of Luke. So again, she makes some good points, but she also makes some bad points. And one of those examples she puts right there in her intro, so I thought that would be an interesting way to start. You can read the progression of that story, the touching, not touching, in John chapter 20 and Luke chapter 24. And I think you'll see the similarities in that, no, there is not a contradiction there.
Most people study the Bible as a means to better understand and form a closer relationship with God. So, does the Bible contain internal contradictions with itself? Yes, it does. Why does it matter? It doesn't really, unless you're a biblical literalist, and it's usually in response to those people that I would point out these inconsistencies.
Now, biblical literalism can mean different things depending on the person. I consider myself to be someone who takes the Bible literally, but I am in disagreement on Bible issues with other people who also take the Bible literally. For example, some would blame the support for genocide in Gaza on biblical literalism, whereas I would say that biblical literalism would prohibit such kind of actions. In my opinion, if I'm going to appreciate the Bible and use it and learn from it, it makes sense to me that I would take it literally, and any contradictions in the text from one part to the other aren't going to affect my desire or ability to take the Bible literally.
I do also think that this is a really beneficial exercise in general if you want to debate, understand the Bible better, if you are interested from a skeptic's or a believer's perspective. Appreciating and understanding the Bible as a collection of texts, as an anthology, is just so important in getting to the heart of what the actual message of each book is.
Well, absolutely, yeah. These are different writings written by different people with different intentions, and it's problematic to just talk about the Bible as a whole, sometimes, to just say, well, this is in the Bible, I believe this because it's in the Bible, do you believe the Bible? Do you believe that what this says because it's in the Bible? Yeah, it matters who wrote it and what they wrote it for. We give weight and validity to parts of the Bible above others. Obviously, any Christian does that. Even the most biblical literalist Christian will do that. An example of where this really matters is Christian eschatology, where you can't just go pulling all these prophecies together and giving them an interpretation and a context that they weren't actually written for, and then making these end-time narratives out of them. That's an example of the importance of understanding these works as separate works and the purpose of those separate works, what the author wrote them for and who the author wrote them to.
If we try and take the entire Bible as a single cogent story, we run into serious problems trying to understand the author's intentions. So taking these all as separate books with separate meanings is crucial to understanding the intentions of the author. If that's important to you for either reasons spiritual, cultural, or just out of academic interest, a great place to start is with finding and acknowledging the differences between these stories.
I have to disagree with her on that point about these not being part of a single cogent story, though yes, they were written by different people in different times for different situations. They do also form a continuity, and as proof of that, I would like to point to the authors themselves and what they wrote, very often acknowledging the continuity of what they're writing, acknowledging past writings and how what they themselves are writing fits into that broader inspired narrative. So I think you can actually understand the books of the Bible in both ways, understanding them as individual writings with a specific purpose, but then also appreciating the very obvious continuity threads that do go through from one book to the next, that the authors themselves acknowledge. Just as a few examples here, I'm going to say, look at Paul's Hebrews chapter 11, where he references the historical and prophetic writings heavily as he's putting out his theory on faith. Look at the entire book of Revelation, which is just like a compilation and paraphrasing of all these Old Testament and some New Testament prophecies, and just putting them all together, making this narrative with Jesus as part of it. Look at how the Psalms are constantly referencing the law. The historical books reference the prophets, and the prophets reference the Chronicles and the historical books. In the prologue to Sirach, the author acknowledges previous writings on law and wisdom, and puts that writing into that context, saying that it's to help the reader to have a greater understanding of previously written scriptures. In fact, I'd say that in almost every book of the Bible, there is evidence that the author was writing with continuity in mind.
If you do not want to trust an agnostic atheist on the internet, I completely understand. You can do this yourself very easily. All you need is a pencil, a piece of paper, and a Bible. Usual disclaimer, I use the English Standard Version.
Well, respect to Emma for using the ESV. That's a great translation and one of my top 3 English translations. And also, I really appreciate her respectful attitude towards the Christian Bible. Even though I don't think she's right about everything she says, I think she is approaching this topic in good faith, and I think she does genuinely appreciate the goodness of this text, though she may not believe in it the way that I, or maybe you, do.
Let's start at the beginning, figuratively and literally, if we're looking at the Bible. One of the best known contradictions in the Hebrew Bible is between Genesis chapters 1 and 2, probably because it is literally at the very beginning, so more people have read it. Now, Genesis 1 and 2 are notably different, both in terms of the order of creation and the described events, but also the literary style and the kind of format. I don't know why I'm doing this. Genesis 1 is more direct and organised. Genesis 2 is a bit more lyrical, shall we say. At the capital B beginning, God created man and animal. But in what order? In Genesis 1, he created all the animals and then man to have dominion over them. In Genesis 2, God created Adam and then thought, damn, he looks kinda lonely. And then created all the animals and let Adam name them. Cute. Genesis chapter 1 verse 25, and God made the beasts of the earth according to their kinds, and the livestock according to their kinds, and everything that creeps on the ground according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth. Genesis chapter 2 verse 18. Then the Lord God said, it is not good that the man should be alone. I will make him a helper fit for him. Now out of the ground the Lord God formed every beast of the field and every bird of the heavens, and brought them to man to see what he would call them. This is probably the most referenced contradiction in the Hebrew Bible because A, as I said, it's literally at the very beginning, and B, it's a very straightforward contradiction. Genesis chapter 1 says something different about the order of creation to Genesis chapter 2.
So Genesis chapter 2 is talking about the creation of the Garden of Eden and God placing the first humans in the Garden of Eden. It's not a retelling of the events in the first chapter. They're 2 different stories. Now, younger creationists would say that it is a story that takes place within the context of day 6 of Genesis chapter 1, or old earth creationists, intelligent design type Christians would say that this could be something that happened long after the original 6-day creation. But no, it's not a contradiction, and you even see right there, right at the very beginning of chapter 2, the author acknowledging the previous events and then going on to tell this story about the Garden of Eden. Now, maybe there is some confusion, because I know in the popular imagination, the original earth right after the creation is sometimes conflated with Garden of Eden, but they're different things. You know, there's earth, and the Garden of Eden is a place on earth where God places the first humans. So, no, telling the story of the six-day creation and then telling the story of the creation of the Garden of Eden are not contradictory stories.
Additionally, Genesis 1 refers to God as Elohim, and Genesis 2 refers to God as Yahweh Elohim. For these reasons, as well as these stylistic and structural differences in the text, it's widely believed that there are two different authors in Genesis. The religious tradition, of course, is that this was all written by Moses.
Oh, sure. Yeah, Genesis had multiple authors. That doesn't make it contradictory, but yeah, it was clearly compiled over a long period of time. Moses probably did an early version of it, which is why it is attributed to him. But there is reference in Genesis to a later period when Israel had kings, so clearly it wasn't finished until much later, probably during the Second Temple period, or the exile in Babylon period. But personally, I think that the variety in style in those early chapters of Genesis, I think that adds a lot of flavor and even validity to those stories. I don't think that counts as being a contradiction, the fact that there were numerous sources and numerous authors involved in recording those stories in the early part of the book of Genesis.
Let's talk about David's census. The moral of the story is humility to the Lord. David sinned by counting his military instead of trusting God. So who commanded such a sinful thing as counting his military? Well, according to 2 Samuel, God did. 2 Samuel chapter 24. Again the anger of the Lord was kindled against Israel, and he incited David against them, saying, "Go number Israel and Judah." So the king said to Joab, the commander of the army who was with him, "Go through all the tribes of Israel, from Dan to Beersheba, and number the people, that I may know the number of the people." Pretty clear. God spoke to David, said, "Go do it," and David went and did it. This is a little confusing. God was essentially so pissed off that he incited the sin himself, which, if you were inclined to have the theological debate, could imply a contradiction with James 1:13, as well as several other places. God cannot be tempted to sin. I'll leave that with you to think about.
Well, the New Testament certainly clarifies a lot of things, and I've seen to some extent in these lists of supposed Bible contradictions, well, the Old Testament says something, but the New Testament says something else, therefore there's a contradiction. I don't think that's fair, because it's kind of baked into our understanding of the Bible that the New Testament brings some ideas that changed the religion of the Old Testament, and it was a new covenant, a new testament. Therefore, there was some difficulty for people of Jesus' time in accepting the things that Jesus was saying. Yet there did come about a greater understanding and clarification of the ways of God. So, for example, the way James is saying something here, as Emma points out, may be different from the way that the author of the Samuel books describe something, and that's okay. That's something that Christians accept, that yes, there was a change in understanding from one age to the next, and that Jesus brought great clarity, and then his apostles in their writings helped to kind of codify a lot of what Jesus said, and this new covenant, this new way of having a relationship with God. The disciples in those epistles give further clarification on it, so that, for example, are we wondering if God can tempt people to do evil? Well, if you look at the Old Testament, and you may find a few verses that are a little puzzling, there are also a lot of places where it's very clear, a lot more clear, kind of the good and not at all evil nature of God. Yet as we move to the New Testament, it becomes even more clear, and that's kind of our final standard, our final way of understanding things.
So God incited David to take the census. Little bit confusing, not to worry, 1 Chronicles fixed the whole thing up. 1 Chronicles chapter 21, verse 1. Then Satan stood against Israel and incited David to number Israel. That's it. It's another pretty clear-cut contradiction in my opinion. One can, and apologists do, come up with ways to mitigate this contradiction. The main claim being that God incited the event by inciting Satan to incite David to sin. God can't commit sin, but he orchestrates everything. Therefore, he is ultimately responsible for Satan inciting David to sin, as a part of God's plan.
Well, I don't agree with those explanations at all. If that's what some apologists are saying about it, I think they're wrong. The book of Samuel in the original Hebrew Old Testament, the book of Samuel, which in our modern Bibles is 1st and 2nd Samuel. That's one of the more problematic Old Testament books. We have cases of numbers that don't make sense, of just things that are just a little off, not quite up to the extremely high standard of most of the Old Testament. Things have gotten lost in the transmission of those Samuel books, unfortunately, and there are some things that to this day Bible scholars still puzzle about. So if you want to say that seems to be at odds with the account in Chronicles and with the broader biblical way of understanding God, I say, yeah, there you have it. It says something that doesn't quite fit with our understanding. Now, some possible reasons, I think, could be just an older way of saying things that kind of got lost in translation. That's the most likely reason for me. Kind of like how in the book of Job, we're not sure to this day if Job's wife tells Job to bless God and die or curse God and die, using very old form of Hebrew and what the possible idioms were of that time, just lost in translation. It's also possible, less likely though, but that the author of that story in Samuel just had an incorrect theology, an incorrect way of understanding things. I prefer my previous explanation better, but the latter one is possible too. In any case, yeah, I have no problem saying that account given in Samuel is different from the way the rest of the Bible generally talks about God and his relationship to evil and temptation, which God does not do, as Emma points out, that James clarifies in James' epistle in the New Testament.
Let's take a quick look at our favourite Hebrew Bible narrative, the Great Flood. Bible quiz! How many of each species was Noah instructed to bring on the ark? The animals came on 2 by 2, hurrah, hurrah! But how many twos? According to Genesis chapter 6, it was 2 of every kind. Simple enough. I have no idea what this is or why I did that. Strangely though, God repeats this command a chapter later. Genesis chapter 7 verses 2 and 3. Take with you 7 pairs of all clean animals, the male and his mate, and a pair of the animals that are not clean, the male and his mate. 7 pairs of the birds of the heavens also, male and female, to keep their offspring alive on the face of the earth.
Well, if you see what happens in between those 2 times that God speaks to Noah, what happens is that Noah builds the ark. So the first time God tells Noah, this is what's going to happen, this is what I want you to do. The second time, it's the ark is built. It's literally time right then to start putting animals onto the ark, because the flood's coming shortly after that. And God tells him, okay, it's going to be this many of these different kinds of animals and 2 of all the rest. Is that a contradiction? I don't think so. I mean, this is like a story. It's coming from one source. This story of the flood. It's just a very short story. It's interesting about the Bible. Probably about half the Bible deals with the downfall of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah. Literally half the Old Testament. I mean, not half the whole Bible, half the Old Testament. The story of the flood that destroys the world gets a few chapters. It's really something, and I wish we had more on the flood, because it's such a fascinating topic, such a fascinating period, and we just get these little glimpses that leave us astounded, and in my case, really wanting more information. Anyhow, so is that a contradiction? I don't think so. It's a story. God comes to Noah and says this, then Noah does it, and then God comes and tells Noah these additional details about putting the animals onto the ark.
The apologist argument here is one that slightly makes me chuckle, to be honest. The apologist argument is simply that God supplemented his original instruction. Okay,
yeah, I guess I'm guilty of that, because that's exactly how I would describe it. Imagine what else God might have said to Noah. Again, this is this huge story, and we only have a few verses covering the whole thing. I just don't see the contradiction there. We're covering years and years and years, and we get a few little glimpses at God saying things to Noah here and there, and no, there's not a contradiction. In one place he says, do this, and another place he adds on to that first one because it's maybe over 100 years later and then it's time to actually do that thing.
But it strikes me personally as a little odd that the all-knowing God wouldn't just make his instructions clear in the first instance.
Well, if that's what you're calling a contradiction, then you could say everything's a contradiction because God didn't say it all right at the beginning. No, come on, God says something here and then he says something there, and the Bible's a big book. It's kind of is an ongoing thing. Look at the prophets. God says one thing, then he says another thing, then he says another thing, and sometimes those things change, sometimes the message changes, and it's not a contradiction. It's because things are happening in time, and people are doing things, and God comes in and says things at different times. That's maybe you don't like it. Maybe you say God should have said more things at one time than at another, but that doesn't make it a contradiction.
On another personal note, one thing that has always slightly confounded me about the Hebrew Bible is this attempt to reconcile the character of God as one consistent entity. God is all-powerful, all-knowing, all-loving, and unchanging through each text in the Bible canon. And yet, in Ezekiel chapter 18 verse 20, we're told that the son should not bear the iniquities of the father. The soul who sins shall die. The son shall not suffer for the iniquity of the father, nor the father suffer for the iniquity of the son. The righteousness of the righteous shall be upon himself, and the wickedness of the wicked shall be upon himself. Seems nice, seems fair, that's a moral I 100% get behind. But if we travel back to Exodus for a moment, you'll probably be familiar with this section as the 10 Commandments in Exodus. Chapter 20, verse 5, this is God telling you not to make graven images. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the 3rd and 4th generations of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands who love me, blah, blah, blah. That is God, in one book of the Bible, very specifically saying, if you do this thing, I will visit the iniquity of the gentleman who does it on his children for several generations. And a chapter in another book of the Bible that says, the children shall not bear the iniquity of the father. It's a straight-up contradiction, yo!
Well, this isn't a unique instance. It's a very good example, but there is a lot of this throughout the Bible where God will come in and say something that seems quite different, at least from the way people understood what God had said in the past, and that's what's going on here. In fact, you just have to go back to the beginning of this chapter, beginning of this prophecy, and it starts off with an acknowledgement of how people perceived this issue, likely based on the law of Moses. God says, you have seen things this way, but I don't want you to think that way anymore. And then he goes on to explain that no, the children are not going to be suffering punishment for the sins of their fathers. You understand what's happened to Israel at this time that Ezekiel is giving this prophecy. Huge changes have happened. A lot's gone on since the time of the Exodus. They've gone through the Judges period, the Kingdom period. That's all ended. Jerusalem has been destroyed. People are living in Babylon, Ezekiel himself being one of those people, and he's giving this prophecy about where things stand now and where things are going. And God, in this prophecy, is saying, you have this idea that the sins of the father will be continued on in punishment on the children, but don't think that way anymore. And then he lays out the way that things really are. Now, is this a clarification of the law, or is this something new that God is saying? That's a discussion to be had on. I'll leave that for another time, but please leave your comments below. But I just want to say that yes, this is a good point that Emma brings out. There is a solution for it. The more you read of Ezekiel and the major prophets, the more you'll understand it. But even just in this chapter, that point is addressed.
Here's a phrase you might be familiar with. No man is without sin. Excluding Jesus, the generally accepted tradition is that all men sin. In this case, men meaning mankind, thus including silly little guys. Ecclesiastes chapter 7 verse 20. Surely there is not a righteous man on earth who does good and never sins. Similarly, Romans chapter 3 verse 23. For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus. That's a big part of the story for a lot of people. We are all sinners, we have all sinned, therefore we all require salvation by Jesus and his forgiveness. That seems fine, but for a point we might recall from Genesis chapter 6, verse 9, these are the generations of Noah. Noah was a righteous man, blameless in his generation. Noah walked with God. That is why Noah alone, plus his family, was chosen by God to be the lone survivor in his great upending of the world he made. Then let's consider for a moment poor old Job, caught in the crossfire of a battle between God and Satan. Chapter 1, verse 1. There was a man in the land of Uz whose name was Job, and that man was blameless and upright, one who feared God and turned away from evil. The entire point of the story is that Satan tries to turn a blameless, righteous man away from God. Well, perhaps blameless doesn't really mean without sin, some argue. Unfortunately, that does not save us from this particular contradiction. 1 John chapter 5, verse 18, we know that everyone who has been born of God does not keep on sinning, but he who was born of God protects him, and the evil one does not touch him. That same letter does specify that the qualifications for being born of God means believing that Jesus is the Christ and loving the Father. So, dropped my Bible in a really dramatic way by mistake. So, no man is without sin. No man continually does good and never sins, except Christians. The only way around this contradiction is to no true Scotsman it. AKA, if any Christian ever does sin, they were never a true Christian in the first place. And then it would seem to make all the praying for forgiveness a bit redundant.
Well, this is a huge topic. I've heard Christians discuss this a lot, argue about this. Emma brings up a bunch of points here. I think what she's trying to say is that, look, these different authors in different books have different things to say about the possibility of someone not being a sinner. Some say that everyone sins. Others seem to say that there are instances of someone not being a sinner. Personally, I don't think that's what's being said about Job and Noah. I don't think that what's being said about them contradicts, for example, Paul's writing in his time about from his opinion on what sin is. You know, the story of Job is that, here is someone who was undeserving of all these calamities, and yet these things happened to him. I don't think it's a theological statement on, there once upon a time was this man who never sinned. In fact, if we read the book of Job, lots of commentators, lots of scholars point out that, yes, Job does sin in this book of Job. So the way it starts off, it's like kind of setting the stage for this. It's like a true-to-life allegory. It's this story that happens to this man, and it was such an outstanding story. It raised such big and terrible questions, and then all this discussion that goes on around it between Job and his friends and God himself, that it was recorded for the benefit of everyone afterwards to be able to look back and read it. Just this big, tough story that deals with the issues of goodness, blessings, catastrophe. Were these things because Job had sinned? How could something happen to a good man? All those kinds of questions. In Noah's case, tells us that the whole earth is corrupt. Like every thought of man is towards violence. And then there's this person who is not part of that. He is blameless in his generations, as it says. I've heard people say different things about what exactly that means, but I think basically says that Noah and his family were not part of this corruption that had condemned the rest of the world to the point where God decided to destroy it all. He sees that there are these people who are not part of the problem, and therefore they are saved. Kind of like in the case of Lot. It says, there are passages that say similar things about Lot. I'm not sure, I don't remember exactly the words that are used, but basically that Lot wasn't deserving. Lot and his family weren't deserving of the catastrophe that befell Sodom and Gomorrah. It's not to say that Lot never sinned in the way that Paul would describe sin, but that Lot and his family were spared because they weren't part of the problem. They weren't doing the things that brought the catastrophic judgment on Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities in the Jordan Valley. I think getting into the New Testament, where we have Paul saying one thing and John saying one thing, that's a bit more of an interesting case, because these are writers using the same language in the same period of history that they're writing in, with the same context of understanding, being, first century apostles, leaders of the early church, and seemingly saying different things about sin, or are they? I'd like to hear what you have to say. I do wonder about some of the things that John says about sin. Now, I will point out that John does seem to acknowledge that a Christian can sin, where he says, "Little children, I write unto you that you sin not, but if you sin, we have an advocate, Jesus Christ the righteous." So I don't think John is stating that once someone has been saved, they will never sin again. But what he's saying is that Jesus saves us from our sins. With Jesus we can overcome sin, and if one who has been saved does sin again, they have a remedy for that through their belief in Jesus. So I admit that it is a bit of a challenge what John says in light of what Paul says. It makes sense to me, although I don't know if I entirely know how to explain it. I can just say, well, here's how to make sense of this. If you have something to say, please be sure to leave your comments below. All right, well, I'm going to stop there for now. After this, Emma goes into the New Testament, which is really interesting. I hope you enjoy this video. Please leave your comments below. If I get enough of a reaction to this, I will certainly continue. I really want to continue. I just want to see how it goes. I think this video is long enough for now. Please see the link to Emma's original video below in the description. Once again, I think she does a good job. All the points that she brings out, or almost all of them, are interesting points, good questions, good things to ask about, talk about. I've seen some lists of supposed contradictions that are, for one, quite disrespectful towards Christianity, and two, just aren't very good, just kind of dumb stuff. I think she does a good job, and she is respectful, though she is not a Christian. Well, please leave your comments below. Please help out this channel, subscribe, share this video, and I really look forward to talking to you again later. Bye for now.